Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're attempting something pretty ambitious, a deep dive into Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. We've got the first edition from 1781 right here, and let me tell you, it's a beast.
It's known for being a tough read, but trust me, it's worth the effort. Kant tackles some of the biggest questions humans have ever pondered. What can we know? How do we know it? And what are the limits of reason itself?
So for our listeners who maybe haven't cracked open the critique yet, can you give us a quick overview of the main themes before we really dig in?
Absolutely. In a nutshell, Kant is trying to figure out the relationship between our minds and the world. He argues that our experience isn't a passive reflection of reality, but an active construction shaped by the structure of our minds. He introduces this idea called transcendental idealism, which says that we only ever experience the world as it appears to us, filtered through our senses and our own ways of thinking.
Okay, so it's not just the world out there, but the world as we perceive it, right?
Exactly. And to understand how this works, Kant dives into the nature of space and time, the categories of understanding, and the distinction between phenomena, what we experience, and noumena, the things in themselves which we can never truly know. He also explores the limits of pure reason, especially when it comes to metaphysical questions about God, the soul, and freedom.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So where do we even begin with a book this dense and complex?
Well, Kant himself was actually worried about the book's difficulty. He even considered including lots of examples to make it clearer, but ultimately decided against it.
Wait, really? Why would he do that? Examples usually help.
He felt that examples could oversimplify the intricate system he was building. It's like trying to explain quantum physics using only apples and oranges. You might get the gist, but you'd miss all the nuance.
Okay, I get it. So he wanted to be as precise and rigorous as possible, even if it made the book tougher to digest.
Exactly, and that's part of what makes Kant so challenging, but also so rewarding. He forces us to think deeply and carefully about the most fundamental questions.
All right, so let's dive in and see if we can follow his line of thinking. One of the first things that jumped out at me was his discussion of space and time. He says they're not objective features of the world, but rather how our minds structure experience.
Right. It's like saying the world isn't inherently blue, but we're all wearing blue-tinted glasses, so everything looks blue. Kant argues that space and time are like those glasses. They're built into how we perceive things.
He even has this line that really stuck with me. Time is a subjective condition of our human intuition, and in itself, apart from the subject, is nothing.
That's one of the most famous passages in the critique, and it really captures the radical nature of Kant's insight. He's saying that space and time aren't things out there in the world, but rather ways that our minds organize and make sense of experience.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, we can never experience a world without space and time, because those are the very conditions that make experience possible for us.
Exactly. It's a mind-blowing idea, right? It completely changes how we think about the relationship between our minds and the world.
It definitely does. This leads us to another key concept, transcendental idealism.
Right. Transcendental idealism is basically Kant's way of saying that we don't experience the world as it is in itself, but only as it appears to us, shaped by the structure of our own minds.
So it's like we can never step outside of our own minds to see the raw world, only the world as it's filtered through our senses and our ways of thinking.
Exactly. And this has some pretty profound implications for the limits of human knowledge. If we can't access the thing in itself, how much can we really claim to know about reality?
That's a big question. Okay, so if we're stuck inside our own minds, so to speak, how do we even make sense of the world?
Well, that's where the categories of understanding come in.
Okay, tell me more about these categories. What are they and what do they do?
Kant argues that our minds aren't just passive receivers of information. They actively organize and make sense of experience using these innate categories. Things like substance, causality, and possibility. These aren't just things out there in the world, according to Kant, but fundamental ways that our minds structure experience.
So it's like our minds come preloaded with a set of rules or concepts that help us make sense of the chaos of sensory data.
Exactly. Without these categories, experience would just be a jumble of meaningless sensations. Think about it. To understand that a ball is rolling across the floor, you need to apply the concept of causality. That one event, someone pushing the ball, caused another event, the ball moving.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but if these categories are in us, not out there, Doesn't that raise some questions about what we can really know about the world?
Absolutely. And that's one of the most challenging and thought-provoking aspects of Kant's philosophy. He's forcing us to rethink the very foundations of knowledge.
This is definitely making my brain work. So we've talked about space and time, transcendental idealism, and the categories of understanding. What's next in our journey through the critique?
Well, now that we've laid some groundwork, we can start to explore Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, which gets to the heart of his theory of knowledge.
Okay, I'm ready to go deeper into the Kantian rabbit hole. Let's talk about phenomena and noumena.
All right, but buckle up. It's about to get even more mind-bending. Welcome back to our deep dive into Kant's critique of pure reason. When we left off, we were about to plunge into the depths of phenomena and noumena, Kant's way of separating the world we experience from the world as it truly is.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that we can never really know the thing in itself. It feels like we're trapped in a hall of mirrors.
It's a profound and unsettling idea, isn't it? Kant argues that the world we experience, the world of phenomena, is the world as it appears to us, shaped by our senses and our categories of understanding. But he also says there's another level of reality, the noumena, which we can never directly access.
So it's like there's this whole other dimension of reality lurking beneath the surface of our experience, but we can only glimpse it indirectly, like shadows on a wall.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You're watching a movie. The images on the screen, the dialogue, the music, that's the phenomena, the world as we perceive it. But what about the film reel itself, the projector, the electricity powering it all? Those are like the noumena, the underlying structures that make the experience possible, but which we don't directly see.
Okay, that's a helpful analogy. But why does Kant even bother with the noumena if we can't know anything about them? Why not just focus on the world we can experience?
That's a great question. Kant argues that the concept of the noumena is necessary to account for the possibility of experience at all. He's saying there has to be something that gives rise to the appearances, even if we can never fully grasp what that something is.
So it's like saying there must be a playwright who wrote the movie script, even if we never get to meet them or ask them about their intentions.
Precisely, and that's a key point of tension in Kant's work. He acknowledges the limits of human knowledge, but he also recognizes the human impulse to seek ultimate explanations, to go beyond the surface of things.
It's like we're driven by this desire to know the why behind everything, even if that why might be forever beyond our reach.
Exactly. And this leads us to another key aspect of Kant's philosophy, his exploration of the limits of pure reason.
Okay, let's talk about that. What does he mean by pure reason, and why is it so limited?
For Kant, pure reason refers to our capacity to think abstractly, to reason logically, and to draw inferences without relying on sensory experience. It's the kind of reasoning we use in math, for example, or when we're trying to figure out the cause of an event.
So it's about thinking things through, using logic and deduction, rather than just observing the world around us.
Right. But Kant argues that pure reason, while powerful, has its limits. He says it can't prove or disprove some of the biggest questions we grapple with, like the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, or the freedom of the will.
Wait, why not? I mean, people have been trying to use reason to prove those things for centuries.
They have. But Kant argues that those concepts lie beyond the realm of possible experience. They're not things we can observe or measure. So pure reason, which is grounded in experience, can't get a handle on them.
So it's like trying to use a telescope to study subatomic particles. The tool isn't designed for that kind of investigation.
Exactly. And Kant argues that when we try to use pure reason to prove these metaphysical concepts, we end up getting caught in what he calls transcendental illusions.
Okay, now we're back to those illusions again. Can you give me a concrete example of what a transcendental illusion might look like?
Sure. One classic example is the idea that we can use pure reason to prove the universe must have had a beginning in time. Kant argued that this leads to contradictions because it tries to apply the concept of time, which is part of our experience, to something that by definition transcends experience, the totality of the universe itself.
So it's like saying because every event I've ever experienced had a cause. Therefore, the universe itself must have had a cause. But the universe isn't just another event within time. It's the container for all events.
Precisely. Kant would say we're trying to apply a category of understanding causality to something that lies beyond the realm where that category applies.
I see. So it's not that these questions about God, the soul, or the universe are meaningless, but that we have to be careful about the tools we use to try and answer them.
That's a great way to put it. Kant isn't saying we should abandon these big questions, but that we need to be aware of the limits of pure reason and to seek other ways of approaching them.
Okay, so if pure reason isn't the right tool for these big questions, what is? Does Kant offer any alternatives?
He does. And this is where his concept of practical reason comes in.
All right, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about practical reason and how it differs from pure reason.
Well, for Kant, practical reason is concerned with morality, with what we ought to do rather than just what we can know. It's the part of us that makes judgments about right and wrong, good and evil.
So it's less about describing the world and more about prescribing how we should act in the world.
Exactly. And Kant argues that practical reason gives us a different kind of access to those big questions that pure reason struggles with.
But how does that work if we can't prove the existence of God or the soul through pure reason? How can practical reason help us?
Well, Kant argues that our moral sense, our innate understanding of right and wrong, points to something beyond the purely material world. It suggests a realm where our actions have ultimate significance, where justice is possible, and where our moral striving isn't in vain.
So he's saying that our very experience of morality implies something like God, freedom, and immortality, even if we can't prove those things scientifically.
Exactly. And he calls this kind of certainty we have about these things moral certainty. It's not the same as empirical proof, but it's no less powerful in guiding our lives.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects, but I have to admit this is all pretty heady stuff. Can you give me a real-world example of how practical reason might play out in our everyday lives?
Sure, think about the idea of human rights. The idea that every person has inherent dignity and worth, regardless of their race, gender, or social status. We can't prove that human rights exist in the same way we can prove a scientific fact. But for Kant, the very idea of morality, of treating each other with respect and fairness, rests on the assumption that we are all ends in ourselves, not merely means to some other end.
So practical reason tells us that we ought to treat each other with respect, even if we can't scientifically prove why we should.
Exactly. And that's a powerful idea that has shaped the course of history and continues to motivate social and political movements around the world.
Okay, this is all starting to make a lot more sense now. But there's still one thing I'm wondering about. If practical reason is all about morality, does that mean Kant thinks we should just ignore our feelings and act like robots following a set of rules?
Not at all. Kant recognized the importance of moral feeling, of compassion and empathy. He just didn't think those feelings should be the sole basis for our moral decisions.
So it's not about being cold and calculating, but about finding a balance between reason and emotion.
Exactly. Kant saw moral feeling as a kind of motivator, a way to energize our commitment to doing what's right. But ultimately, our actions should be guided by principle, not just by feeling.
It's like saying, I might feel a surge of sympathy for someone in need, and that feeling might prompt me to help them. But the reason I should help them is because it's the right thing to do, regardless of how I feel.
That's a great way to put it. Kant would likely say that our feelings can be fickle and unreliable, whereas the moral law is constant and universal.
Okay, so it's about having a moral compass, a set of principles that guide our actions, even when our emotions might be pulling us in different directions.
Precisely. And this leads us to one of Kant's most famous and challenging ideas, the categorical imperative.
Ah, yes, the categorical imperative. I've heard of it, but I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it means. Can you break it down for us?
Of course, in essence, the categorical imperative is a principle that tells us what our moral duty is. Kant formulated it in a few different ways, but one of the most famous is act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
Okay, so that means we should only act in ways that we could reasonably want everyone else to act in the same situation.
Exactly. It's a test of universalizability. If the rule you're following couldn't be applied universally, then it's not a morally sound principle.
So if I'm thinking about lying to get out of a jam, I have to ask myself, would I want everyone to lie whenever it's convenient? And the answer is obviously no, because that would undermine trust and make society impossible.
Precisely. The categorical imperative helps us to see that morality isn't arbitrary or subjective. It's based on principles that are rooted in our shared capacity for reason.
It's like saying we're all playing by the same rules, and those rules are based on logic and fairness, not just on what we happen to feel like doing in the moment.
Exactly. And this leads to another important practical implication of Kant's ideas, the dignity of every human being. Kant argues that because we are all rational beings, we are all ends in ourselves, not merely means to some other end.
So we shouldn't treat other people as objects or tools to be used for our own purposes.
Yeah.
We should respect them as autonomous individuals with their own inherent worth.
Precisely. And this respect for human dignity has profound implications for how we interact with each other, how we structure our societies, and how we think about justice and fairness.
It's like saying everyone deserves to be treated with respect regardless of their social status,
Yeah.
their wealth, their intelligence, or any other external factor.
Yes, and that's a powerful message that has inspired social and political movements for centuries. It's at the heart of ideas like human rights and the importance of treating everyone with equal dignity and respect.
Wow, it's amazing to think that all of this flows from Kant's exploration of the nature of reason and experience.
Hmm.
It's like he's built this whole philosophical system that connects our inner world of thoughts and feelings to our outer world of actions and relationships.
That's a great observation, and I think that's what makes Kant's work so enduringly relevant. It's not just about abstract philosophical concepts. It's about understanding what it means to be human, what it means to live a moral life, and how we can create a more just and equitable world.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of the critique in this deep dive, but it's been an incredible journey.
I agree, there's so much more to explore in Kant's work, but I hope this has given our listeners a taste of his profound and challenging ideas.
And maybe inspired them to pick up the critique themselves and see what insights they can discover.
That would be wonderful after all. As Kant himself said, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own reason and see where it leads you.
What a fantastic note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Immanuel Kant. It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep daring to know.